And if you look at Dallas in particular, you can, we have a model that looks at the baseline, a high growth economy, and a deep recession. This is the deep recession, kind of Greek style. And this shows the baseline, and this shows strong growth in the economy. And this is sort of kind of the way I'm looking at the market right now. And what this says is that, there's still, there's, aside from the fact that there's a lot of disequilibrium in the market still, the capital markets are still somewhat in disarray. Aside from that, this seems to suggest, and the other markets we're looking at too are very similar, seems to suggest that we have strong underpinnings in terms of rental growth expectation. And the last one is why we are excited. And we're excited because the economy is gathering speed. And as the economy gathers speed, more people are going to be buying things and working in office buildings and doing other kinds of things. And the last one is this. And this shows the land of upside down deals. And this is actually Dante's Inferno. And these are the legs sticking out of sulfurous pits of some of Dante's enemies. And I kind of like this because it reminds me of this great slide. And this shows the cumulative distress of all property types from 2008. This has been resolved. This is REO, real estate owned by financial institutions, and this is this troubled real estate. This is part of our strategy. There's still a lot of this out there. And when I look at the real estate market, this says to me, what a great time to be doing value-added and opportunistic investing. And one last. And now it's time for questions. I've talked for a while, but I like this slide because just when you think you've covered everything, you find that you may have missed something. So at this point, I'd like to thank you for your patience, and I'd like to, if there are any questions, I'm here to answer them. Mahesh. Yes, sir, Francis.
Yes, when you were looking at your real estate curve and the opportunities and the distributions, you have to have some kind of mathematical expectation, if you will, and for that you need probabilities. Is there any evidence-based way of determining what the probabilities of something will happen? Or do you have to just go to somebody who's seen a great deal and say, well, I think there's a 70% chance of this or 30% chance of that?
There are a couple of approaches. When you use I'm going to use the word Monte Carlo analysis. It's not something you would normally do in Monte Carlo, on the Mediterranean, but it's a way of, instead of thinking about variables or numbers as discrete numbers, you're thinking about probability distributions. Now your question is, how do you come up with the probability distributions? And there are several ways of doing that. What I did, just for sake of illustration, I just looked at the NCREIF index over time. That's not the correct way. If you're building the inputs, for, let's say, revenues or rents or other kinds of things, or tenant default probabilities. What you try to do is you try to look at similar events and you try to get data and you try to build these probabilities, but sometimes you can't. So what you do is, instead of finding a nice bell, estimating a nice bell curve or something with a lot of skew in it, right? It's non-symmetric. What you can do is you can do the following. Say, look, based on history or based on expectations, I think the worst it's going to be is this number. The best it's going to be is this number, and it's more likely to be this. And you put together a triangular distribution. And then it's always imprecise. But what it does start to do is, when you then model in your Excel sheet all of the structure of the deal and all of the other things, what it allows you then to do is, when you look at the output, which is maybe the net present value or the IRR or anything else, it allows you to understand how seemingly inconsequential changes in the contract terms, the JV agreement, or anything can affect the outcome. And then you ask the following question. If I were in your shoes, I'd ask the following question. I really am agnostic about the inputs. I'm not sure what the distributions look like. But given my uncertainty, what I'd like to know is, Can I put together a deal structure or a portfolio strategy such that the result is robust, given my ignorance?
Yeah.
So it's a question of how you apply it, and it's like automobiles. If you put an automobile in the hands of a child or somebody who's inexperienced, it's probably a bad idea. And it's the same thing with all of these techniques.
As a matter of analysis, can you could you create examples of various probabilities? So you say, okay, this is at a 30% probability of something that happened.
Right.
Then you do again at 40%.
Can you go back to that slide? Let's go back.
And you look at different scenarios using these hypothetical probabilities to see what fundamentals wind up sticking out that control for that.
Yes.
That even out the risks.
Yeah, we actually can do that pretty easily. You can actually, let's go back, keep going back further. I'm going to answer your question in two ways. I think this is really, go back, the other way. There you go, the other way. I wanted to tell you something that I had omitted. Let's assume that this is the right probability distribution, the right estimate of risk. Let's assume that. The great thing about this, and let's say this is the output on the net present value on the deal, or the IRR. What this allows us to do is ask the following question. This is a zero return here. And what it says up here is that if you integrate under this, this should equal 100%, right? Because if this involves all of the potential outcomes, it has to be 100%, right? Okay, what this says here is, what I can do is, by measuring the area under this curve, this says to me, there's over time, there was 11% of the time that there was a zero rate of return on this. Now what I can do with this is, I can define, let's say we have a very simple problem. We have revenues and we have expenses, and I define the distributions for each. And then at the very bottom where the cash flow comes out, I divide it in two ways. I have one tranche called preferred, and they get 50% of anything positive. And then the other is the rest. And you get those distributions. Now what I can do is, when I put the model together with the distribution for the rents and the expenses, what I do is not only come up with the distribution, but I also can define the correlation between them. And this is really important. When most people do Excel analysis of deals, companies, whatever, most of the stuff we did on the street, it was deterministic. But in the derivatives area and fixed income, we use these techniques. Because what it allows us to do is, it allows us to explicitly incorporate risk and the correlation among these distributions. And what you sometimes get are very surprising results. You think you've structured the deal so that it has very low risk. And in fact, there may be risk elements that you haven't considered. Now, the objection to all of this, people say, well, you're making a lot of assumptions. Well, you're making assumptions explicit. You're not hiding it. I remember when I got into real estate in 1980, I was going down the street with somebody from the UK. And we were looking at buildings. And this was just when they were doing lease-by-lease analysis. And he said to me, Randy, he says, we don't need a college professor to tell us how to value buildings. I said, I just have a cap rate. I take the net operating income and I cap it. Yeah. So I asked him a couple of things, and eventually he became a convert. But the thing is, back then he said, all this stuff, you're making assumptions. I understand, but what he was always doing, they were making the same assumptions, but they weren't explicit. I've raised billions of dollars of capital, and I worked on all kinds of deals. I worked on the securitization of Rockefeller Center and stuff like that. And I look at a lot of this as kind of a framework for thinking about the world. It's a framework, and it suggests the questions, right? You can't be a slave to this, right? And so I look at it as kind of a guideline. I one time told a developer, I said, you're really in the business of managing a portfolio of options. And he looked at me and he said, what? He had gnarled fingers and all of that. He'd gone through one of the crashes. And I said, no, you really are. You have this intuition. And I kind of explained what he does. And he said, you're right. Now that I understand that, I am in that business. People who are great investors, whether it's a Warren Buffett or a great developer, they have this intuition about these things. And while, some of us are in the back room trying to work out formulas and things like that. These people are out there at the barricades, and they just had this intuition. So they're buying options that are cheap, and they're selling options that are expensive, and they're constantly doing that. And they had this intuition. And the greatest developers I've ever met know how to do that. And so while this is a framework for thinking about things and sensitizing you to some of the issues, there's no substitute for experience. But this kind of stuff can sometimes get you through those parts of the market where experience is lacking, i.e. in a crash. So it's important for a good team to have access to both.
Thank you. With that,
Thank you.
Randy, really appreciate it. Good job.
Thank you.